Good morning and a warm welcome to all those who have joined us here today. Hope you are all in good health and staying safe. Our guest speaker for today is Mr. Sujit Sumithran. Good morning, sir. An executive and leadership coach and change catalyst, Mr. Sujit works with large corporations such as Asian Paints, Birla Sun Life, Cipla, Motorola Mobility India, MTR Foods, Novartis, Oracle, Samsung, Times Group, and the Hindu, among others, and supports them in their people development initiatives. After serving in various sales management positions as part of various companies, he served as a training consultant and partner consultant for Dave Carnegie India and Erewhon Innovation Consulting India, respectively. In 2012, he founded the Yellow Submarine, where he has been coaching senior leaders and leadership teams to help them find innovative solutions to business problems. Now, to the business end of his profile. At 50, Mr. Sujit figured that there was more to life than just working, and thus the joy of baking was discovered. His love for baking is deep rooted, as he himself says. He bakes mainly for friends and family, and while he doesn't sell bread, he teaches sourdough bread making through hands on workshops. Bread is Mr. Sujit's forte, with sourdough being his idea of expertise. It's a pleasure to have you with us, sir. He will be speaking about the art of making bread, and I'm sure it will be an incredibly interesting session. Over to you, sir.
Really sorry to interrupt. So you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
yes.
so how much time do I have?
About an hour.
No. R is for the entire session. How much time do I have to talk? Then I'm going to take
Up
your
to,
questions.
up to you, sir. Up to you.
Okay, so I'll try and break this down. So most of you, I doubt if there's any one of you who haven't eaten bread as yet. But what most of us have been exposed to, what is popularly industrialized breads. Now, Britannias, Wibs, and whatever you have coming out from most bakeries are quick fix breads. Somebody's got their microphone on, so I can hear a lot of the sounds. So, anyways, so most of the breads that you see today, classical sandwich loaves, normally take from the time they begin about 3 hours to bake. And the reason for this is because they add shitloads of commercial yeast, and that essentially leavens or makes the bread rise up very quickly. Desired structure, but you do not get any of the goodness of the grain which goes in, and that's why a lot of people today are suffering from gluten intolerance. People who suffer from gluten intolerance, when they have slow fermented sourdough breads, they have no at all. So obviously, this one of the challenges that we face with modernization, because before the 60s there was no bread. All breads used to be sourdough breads. There was a process in a plant which is in UK called Chollywood. It's called the Chollywood process, which basically meant that they would add shitloads of commercial yeast and they would bring out something very quickly. So understand is bread um, once upon different. Today, what you eat is mostly industrial bread. A lot of people find and they feel bloated when they eat bread. These are some of the issues because the sufficiently treated. So yeah, so what is I baked for you guys today? Unfortunately, none of you will be able to see it. See this? Is it visible?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'll just show you what the inside looks like. This is what the crumb should look like. So it normally sounds hollow when you tap it. Crusty. This is 100% whole wheat. This is will not have as much rice as maida. I tend to use whole grain breads. A lot of people tend to use only maida while baking bread simply because the bran, which is the outside surface of the wheat, is from where ultimately germinate, are both removed. And so you get pure starch, and pure starch behave far better than when you of fibers and some sort of roughage which comes in. Um, what I'm used to is baking stuff or baking bread the way it used to be baked once upon a time. And ask me questions because otherwise if I go inside this is just going to be it just goes on and on and on. Just pulling myself back, I'm cautious that we have um, I would only say that to eating maida breads, which is what you get, a whole grain bread is a delight. There is some magic in eating because they're just made with flour, water, and salt. There's nothing else which goes inside. Water, salt, the starter or the lova, flour and water. Components, you make something as beautiful as what you just saw. The only, if you can call it a downside, is that if you want to make it right, you have to spend time. So this bread started building at 9 a.m. in the morning. the afternoon, I stage of the loa, which means with what was risen, I added some more water and some more flour, so that would rise up again. I also mixed the flour and the water, mixing the second build of the loa, which is about 245 or so. I would have mixed the flour and the water, and I let it sit there because when you mix flour and water, the gluten gets activated, and slowly you'll see that it behaves very differently as time goes by. At about 5 o'clock of hours after feeding lower, I took out 15% of that, and would mean vis-a-vis the weight of the flour. 150 grams of flour, 15% of that would be 37.5 grams. And I mixed it in, and I added 6.25 grams of salt. You normally add about 5% of salt, 5% of the flour weight, but because the hydration or the water content is 90%, you add grams. All up, and I left it for an hour, and then after every I would stretch and fold the dough. Method called the coil folds, which is where you just lift the dough and it's on either side. And roughly at about 8:30 or so, I I put it away into the fridge. This morning, I put it into at 250 C now. But when I inside a Dutch oven, which is a metal, half an hour, I took it out of the cast iron pot and I put it in naked, and that's what you see. So it's a nice process. A lot of people find it, but I think one of the nice things about this is slow down. It helps you understand that not everything in life fixes. Unfortunately, we all live in a world where quick fixes are the way of life. Nothing wrong with it. Can be a quick fix. Most things in life, time. There's a journey. There's time that everything takes. But we live in a world where everybody is used to everything happening very quickly. Antithesis of that. This is where bread can get done in 3 hours, approximately 15 to 16 hours to bake bread. Bread is a commodity. This is something very special. So, time you put into anything, the more you get out of it. I think that's true for anything in life. So, yeah, that's basically what it is. I haven't spent too much time, but I think if you have questions, that would mean make more sense for me answering them rather than just. Oh,
Um, Hello. Okay, sir. Why sourdough bread? If it's
why sourdough bread? Because it's like saying dosas, instant dosa, which has been slow fermented overnight. It's the same answer. So once upon a time, people had time with a lot of time and patience. Now nobody has time. Everybody wants quick fixes. Sure, quick fixes issues, but the quick fixes also create complications. A lot of us are suffering today because everything is, happening at breakneck speed, which the older generation had. Seem to be having those issues. To be having a lot of issues which they never had. So
So
it's
can you
just
please
a perspective. of do I want everything to be done very quickly, wants to take the time that I need to give it, wants to become.
So can you please just run us through your starter process? Like how do you start a starter and
So making a starter is a slow process. It takes roughly a week. Use a bowl and grams of water and 50 grams of flour. Mix it till it's a nice composite thing. Cover it with cloth and put a rubber band around it. Was just stir the whole thing up. This morning at 9. At 9 in the night, you'll stir it up. You'll put the cover on and you'll leave it. Tomorrow morning again, you'll do it. Tomorrow night, you'll see that there are bubbles, which means there's some sort of fermentation which has begun. You had 50 and 50, which is 100 grams in it. Leave 25 grams in it, 75 grams. And to that 25 grams, you'll add 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour. So from 100 grams, which was the original mix, you're now taking the mix to 225 grams. 200 grams which you added of flour and water will become food for the microorganisms which are present in the 25 grams. Refresh this every 12 hours. Next day at 9 in the morning, you'll throw away 200 grams, add 100 plus 100. At night, you'll throw away 200 grams, add 100 plus 100. So you'll find that approximately you'll find that every time you feed it, and there's nothing which happens, rising up to 3 times the original level, marked by putting a rubber band or the starter bottle with a marker pen. And once it reaches the top, it will maintain its position there for a while. And it will start dropping. When this happens for about 2 to 3 times, you know your starter is ready. You will feed it one final time, which is 25 plus 100 plus 100, and put it away into your fridge. You have your starter then.
so we have a question. Can you please tell us one of your favorite easy sourdough bread recipes?
What is my favorite?
And easy sourdough recipe.
Easy sourdough recipe. As is the case with everything in life, if you've done it enough times, it gets easy. It can be quite frustrating. It can be, but I think it's a question of how you make time for this. So if you look at that I spent perhaps about 10 minutes in the morning just mixing, and in the afternoon, maybe another 10 minutes mixing the second build of the starter, the 10 minutes or 15 minutes to mix the dough, water. And then after that, it'll take about 15 to 20 minutes mix the starter to mix the salt. It's about less than a minute every time because all you're doing is you're just stretching and folding the dough. Then the next morning, you tuck it away into the fridge. Then the next morning, you take it out of the fridge and put it into the oven. So the amount of time that you actually spend with the dough across us with great difficulty would be more than minutes. So you are not doing most of the work. The dough is doing most of the work. You're just facilitating. You're not creating anything, helping things to get together. Forms of cooking where you have to intervene and you have to do things. You're just watching the signals and then you're doing what is required. It's actually not so much work, but it's spread over a certain number of hours, and that's when people tend to think that this takes too much time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Another
Sure.
question. Can you please talk about hydration percentages and what is the
Yes.
difference between a low hydration dough to a highly hydrated?
So hydration is essentially the quantity of water that you add into the dough. If you look at breads that you get, which is let's say in the store, modern bread, Britannia bread, those kind of things, are normally operating at about 60%, 50 to 60% hydration. This means that quantity of flour, there is 60% hydration. 100 grams of flour, you'll add 60 grams of water. Hydration. Now this is because most of the doughs that these guys make have a lot of maida, enough roughage, so it doesn't need too much water. I showed you is 100% whole grain. 100% whole grain tends to be very thirsty. I have made is 90% hydration. So for 250 grams of flour, I've used 225 grams of water. Is nothing but the percentage of water to the percentage of flour. Making rustic breads, make something called as enriched breads. In enriched breads, the dough by adding stuff like fat. So you could add butter, yeah, you could add these kind of things. And so suddenly the dough, instead of just having a rustic flavor, which is just flour, water, and salt, have some softening incorporated by adding the fat comes in by comes in instead of water. So this is what you do. Question?
Yes, sir. Thank you. How does one know if the bread has risen too much or not enough?
Sure. How does one know if the bread has risen too much? Um, that is the right question. The right question would be bread has risen. Most often, I see people having a problem with bread not rising at all. So, is you able to understand works, how much time it takes vis-a-vis the flour blend that you're using. If you're using instance, you will find that your dough becomes double the size. And when it becomes double the size, you just put it inside. Most people who are experienced bakers will not wait for the dough to become double. Out at approximately 75%, and they will let the doubling happen in the oven. If entered, then what will happen is its strength and it starts dropping, and that good, uh, from a well as a flavor aspect, various things like that. I think when you keep baking, you'll understand. All of us who have baked, occasions when we've had we've not had enough rice. It seems a little the there, but it doesn't seem to be optimum. So it's hard to explain this, but fundamentally, flour that you use, if you use maida, you'll get more rice. If you use atta, you'll get less rice. Simply because atta has got a lot of the bran and stuff like that, which doesn't allow rice to happen. So it will just rise.
Yes, sir. What is the
Okay, so
expiry date? Yeah,
what is the
so
expiry date?
for a bread
What
which
is
is
the
made
expiry?
today.
Um, Homemade breads normally do not have anything added. Like the one which I have made is water and salt. This is pure sourdough bread, so it should 4 to 5 days without anything happening. That's because it's got lactic acid bacteria in it and tends to push away other pathogens which tend to attach themselves to food. Keep normal bread out for a few days, you will find that you'll see mold and you'll see fungus and you'll see all those kind of things happening. With these, it doesn't happen. Um, but that's because of the process that you're using to bake the bread, because it's with a sourdough starter. That's the reason it will not happen with regular bread.
Is it hard to find strong bread
Yeah,
flour in India? And are there any good alternatives?
it is impossible to get strong bread flour in India because we make is mostly meant for flatbreads. Um Different situation altogether because abroad people uh, flours. When they talk of bread flour, they're talking of maida, of whole grain. So flours that I use is EWF, and they use a flour called flour X. So it's a combination of three different flours. It's a combination of ancient wheat. Ancient wheat is fabulous because it has a beautiful flavor profile, wasn't very strong on gluten. Also has modern wheat, which is not so great on flavor, but is fabulous when it comes to gluten. Touch of barley. So between these three things is that I showed you is difficult to get with regular store bought or even chucky milled. Different story altogether. Maida is not about. It's just about using dough. It's not about whole grain bread at all.
Yeah. Is there any process to revive a
Yeah.
starter if you haven't fed it for a while?
So I often say that once you make your starter, you should keep it into the fridge, and you have to feed it every month to 2 months. If you haven't fed it for 6 months, then perhaps you should feed it and see if it works fine. If it doesn't work, you start all over again. What do you expect? You can't always bring back something to life which you have killed.
Is there any way you can utilize the discard from the process of the starter?
There are lots of there's a cracker recipe which is there on. Incidentally, for those of you who are interested, an online course called Easy Peasy. Babes, sorry, people. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So I was saying, for those of you who are interested in learning how to make bread, learning how to make your own starter, online course which I have, which is free of cost. It's from Zenler, Zenler. And do is you can just or HTTPS 2 forward slashes sourdough SUJITERAN sourdough one word dot Zenler ZENLER. If you go to that site, all you have to do is enter your email ID and a password, and that's it.
Okay, what is the proper storage method for a sourdough starter?
People who bake every day, bakers who bake every day, they feed it twice every day and they bake twice every day. who are going to bake once in a while, the only way to store it is to keep it in the refrigerator.
Can a starter be made with any kind of flour?
Has to be made with a flour which has gluten if it's done. So if you try using millets, you will not see a rise. So you won't know whether your starter is done or not. Zero gluten, rice is zero gluten. So it doesn't make sense to make it with that. And that's why the best flour for making bread is always wheat, because wheat has gluten. Is
Also, sir, you said that when the starter rises and drops, so we should wait for it to drop for 2 to 3 times before we make the bread, or in the first drop itself we can use the starter.
No, so I would recommend when if you're making your starter, you wait for it to rise and drop that you know that this is now following. When it's following a pattern, everything is okay. You feed it, it then it holds the position, then it starts dropping. If you feed it rise, hold the position, again start dropping. If it happens 3 times, you know that there's a certain um, to it that it seems to be exactly the same as what it was behaving the last time. When you feed it, you want it to rise. That's what you do. When you feed it outside, it rises. You feed it to your dough also rises. That's exactly what this is all about.
How does temperature affect the starter growth?
Temperature affect the starter growth. Um, so all fermentation happens at room temperature. Your starter in the fridge, nothing happens. The yeast doesn't rise, bacteria slows down, and that's what you're doing. If you keep it out, you'll have to feed it twice every day.
Can you please explain to us the history of sourdough?
History of sourdough. Right? Were you talking of history of
Yeah,
sourdough?
yeah.
So nobody knows because it was long back, perhaps many, many years ago, many centuries ago, forefathers tried eating different types and and perhaps what they would have done is in order to make it into a gruel, they would crush with water and then they would consume it. So conjecture, so what has now been accepted is that somebody gruel mixture to some heat source, maybe a fire or something, that must have cooked. They started eating it, and then they figured out that they could probably. So that's how bread came into being. It was a happy accident. Nobody knew exactly how to make bread. Cooking today have been happy accidents because when we evolved from whatever we have evolved from, nobody knew how to do these things.
While working with low gluten wheat types, how much longer does it take for it to rise?
Low gluten, the time it takes to rise wouldn't be so different, but it's just that the rise will be very low with low gluten. Low gluten wheat varieties are mainly ancient wheat. There is one called Paigambari, origins back to the Indus Valley civilization. There are several such ancient wheats which are still available in India. Fabulous when it comes to flavor, but they don't have much of gluten. Perfect for India because most of our breads tend to be flat. They're chapatis or rotis or whatever it is. We don't make leavened bread in India. So when it comes to those kind of things, it's perfect. It's just that make bread with that, you're not going to see much of a rise. You'll just see a little rise, and you have to make do with that. Which is why Indian flours are not so great for making breads. They end up very dense and very chewy, which is another reason why most people tend to use only maida.
So, is there any validity to using pineapple juice, honey, or organic grapes in a sourdough starter?
So there are lots of people who will tell you that you have to use this and use that, but fundamentally, I find that all that is not required. If you just use flour and water, that's good enough. Starter by putting honey or by putting pineapple juice and stuff like that. So these are things which are supposed to accelerate the process. Uh, I don't see how accelerating a process in the beginning is going to help you because it's a week-long process. Let the process take its own time. Believe in.
Are there any books you would recommend to get more in-depth knowledge in bread making?
There are lots of books. Tartine book, but unfortunately, most of the books outside of India for weather conditions, and they will talk of easily available there, not available to us. Things going wrong. Hello, am I online?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Please continue.
Okay. The books which come from abroad with them is just that they assume that anyone who uses them, which is similar to theirs. We talk, or whether we say it's warm here, somebody who's in hardly use that word. We take it for granted that we're talking about something which everybody is familiar with, and that's exactly how books are also written. For challenge, we're okay. You can take any book here for that matter.
Are there any specific places where one can falter while baking a sourdough bread?
I don't think there is an answer for this. I think there are areas that one needs to be careful. First is, do you have active starter? That's the first question, which means every time you feed it, there's a drop. That's the first checkpoint. How many times have you gone through the process? Because when you start a process, you're not going to be proficient with that. Some time before you can actually do it and enjoy it. Initially, you're so concerned about, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? As you do it more and more often, then you start enjoying the whole process. Question of time, but I don't know whether there are easy methods. So the places where I've seen a lot of people, firstly, when it comes to making the starter, they do it mechanically, they don't observe it. That could be one reason. Second is when they're actually fermenting the dough, they don't do it with the care that is required. Is when they are scoring the dough, do it, that kind of thing, instead of just pulling it at one stroke. So areas, but I think, fortunately, each one of these areas, fully online, if you go and you say, how do you make a starter? There are zillions of people who have put up videos on how to make a starter. What is sourdough fermentation? If you look at that, there are zillions of people who show you how. Temperatures may be different, but the steps are more or less the same. Of the bread, there are zillions of people who will show you how to score bread. If you spend some time looking at a few of these, it's only a matter of time before you can get there.
Sir, Sabarish has a question saying, should the starter and the actual flour used to make the bread be the same, or can it be a blend?
No, I mean I know people who use whole wheat starters for making maida breads, maida starters for making whole wheat bread, who use expensive flours for making the bread and cheap flours for making the starter. So it doesn't matter.
Thank you, sir. Aishwarya has a question saying, what is your opinion on gluten-free bread?
I think it's a scam. I think a lot of the gluten-free market be working on people into believing that they have a problem and therefore they should, which is not cheap. Incidentally, there was a person in Goa who had a problem with eating anything which had gluten. Husband one day came home to me and started making gluten-free breads, and we want you to taste it. So I said, fabulous, thank you, leave it here. I couldn't eat it. I mean, I wouldn't know why people would eat something like that. There was no texture. He asked me, what do you think about it? I said, look, I don't like these things, yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem with gluten. Candid with him, and I was a little, perhaps a little too blunt because I never heard from him after that. I really didn't like it. I'm not saying that all the gluten-free stuff is bad, but I think gluten-free breads tend to be gummy. They tend to be, they don't rise heavy. And I'm just saying to make, which is like leavened bread, you can make flatbreads out of that. Have to eat a gluten-free bread. Have an issue with gluten, keep completely. Because I think gluten-free bread is something which has been created simply because there is a fear and people to extract the most out of the market. I don't see it as a I don't see it as a long-term thing. It'll be in certain pockets and yeah. So my personal belief is that celiac disease, which approximately 1% of the population suffer from, away from all things gluten. And I don't think it is right, which looks like bread but doesn't taste like bread. You have, I think it's better that you concentrate on flatbreads, more tasty and far more nutritious rather than all this junk. Plus, when they make free breads, they add shit like xanthan gum and all kinds of crap which are not good for your body. Personally, I'm not who thinks highly of gluten-free breads, but
What
I'm
are
just
the
saying I don't.
what are the couple of pairings with sourdough bread, and why do they go well together?
I think if you look at Indian food, goes well with it because most Indian foods tend to be spicy, and this goes very well with spicy stuff. Curries, especially, most of our curries are perfect for. I don't think sabjis. I don't think cauliflower and those things and it too much goes with any curry, spicy curry.
So Rishi has a question asking, is there an alternative to using a conventional oven?
Um so results you get is when you use a built-in oven because that's the only thing which actually produces the heat that you need. An OTG that that comes close to what can be that comes close. Yeah, most OTGs don't go beyond 200, 210 degrees centigrade, which means that you have to keep the bread inside the OTG for a longer time, which means that the outside gets hard, crust gets thicker, which means it's more difficult when you eat the bread. The challenges, I would recommend that for good sourdough bread, you need a proper, um, and it's not so expensive. Once upon a time, these ovens used to cost easily a lakh plus regular built-in oven. But today, I have one which costed me just 30K. It depends on how much money you have and what. But in case you have a challenge, then there are some OTGs. I think the one from Borosil, I'm hearing good stuff about that OTG, which comes close to what an oven can give. But the basic problem with an OTG is it has thin walls, and so there's a lot of heat which is lost. Therefore, I would recommend if you're using an OTG, you definitely need to use a cast iron pot and your doughs inside that. That's how I would recommend it.
So, what is the first step a person who's interested in opening a bakery should take?
I I think looking at opening a bakery, get your product. Um, what are you going to do? So it's easy to make sourdough bread with a lot of inclusions. For instance, made has some, so it smells very herby. I've just added some herbs while I was doing the final. Um, so stuff like this, or it could be seeds that you add in, be sun-dried tomatoes and rosemary. So I think to have a choice on is it that you want to actually offer. That's one. Second thing is, how are you going to make these? Structure, I think you need the right kind of apparatus. So most people would use not a home-based oven, but you'll need a deck oven of sorts. Yeah, so that's fundamentally it. I think it's the use the infrastructure that you need, products that you're going to bring out. These are the three things that you probably need to. One of the things which challenge, I know this out of my own experience, there were two people who were very interested in sourdough bread, and I taught both of them. But both of them have the person who learned who's
Me, sir. Excuse me, sir.
Hello? I'm
Yes,
sorry, I
yes.
don't know what happened. I think it
No, no problem.
just dropped off the call. Yes. So any questions, guys?
So would a wood-fired oven work? It's a question from Yukta.
Yeah, wood-fired ovens are good. And they don't depend on power. In fact, in Goa, most of the breads that come out are baked in a wood-fired oven. Um, so the only challenge with a wood-fired oven is how do you get the construction of it right? When I came into Goa, I was very enamored by it, and I built one on my own. Unfortunately, the construction wasn't good, so it just wouldn't retain heat. So wood-fired ovens are fabulous. It's just that you need to understand how much, um, unlike um, in electricity driven one where you just change a few knobs, there you can't do anything. You have to just wait for it to cool down, or you have to add more logs of burning logs to up the temperature. So it takes a certain amount of learning to figure out what's the right temperature for the results that you want. Otherwise, I think wood-fired ovens are fabulous.
Okay, sir, this is the last question. What are the different types of yeast that are used?
Different types of yeast that are used. So you get commercial yeast, which comes in the form of packets, which is what most people use. There's also something called baker's yeast, which most of the bakeries use. The commercial yeast has a long life cycle, whereas the baker's yeast doesn't have too much. And then there is the sourdough starter, which anybody can build by themselves. So these are the three forms. The only difference is with the sourdough starter, it has wild yeast and some quantity of lactic acid bacteria, which is what is good for us because they are good for our microbiota, the stuff that lives in our intestines. So that's what it's good for. But other than that, yeah, these are basically the three forms of yeast. There is also another new type which a lot of people have been experimenting with, and that is not made in a packet, but it is also not a sourdough culture. Um, and this is what people will do is they'll take a jar which has water and which has some amount of sweeteners in it, and um, they would put let's say leaves of some plants or flowers or whatever. This is a kind of a fermentation which, and then every 2 days, every day they stir up the water, and after about 2 to 3 days, you'll see a lot of bubbles on the surface. When you see a lot of bubbles on the surface, you know there's some activity which is happening. That stage, you take the plants or whatever you added into it, you take it out, and you take that water and you mix it with flour, and you'll find that that will ferment. Then you take that and you mix it with more flour, that will also ferment. Then you take that and you add it to your dough. So that's a wild yeast starter, which shows you some rise. But the advantage in using sourdough is that there is a depth of flavor which you can't find with only the yeast products. That's fundamentally where sourdough differs from the other stuff. The lactic acid bacteria is virtually negligible in all the other types of breads. And that's fundamentally the difference. Yeah,
Thank you so much for
Anjali?
answering all our questions. Now
My pleasure,
moving
Anjali.
on to a, we'll be moving on to a rapid fire.
Wow. Okay.
So the first question, what is your guilty pleasure?
What is my guilty pleasure? Huh? Did I get that right? What is my guilty pleasure?
Yeah.
I don't know what is the meaning. I'm sorry, I'm not your age group, so I don't understand what the meaning of some of these words are. What do you mean by, so let me ask you, what is your guilty pleasure?
So guilty pleasure is something that you absolutely adore to do, and you make time specifically just to get it done.
So for me, it is about just making bread. You have one little loaf of bread. That's all that you have. I don't know if that makes sense, Anjali.
Yes, sir, of course.
Okay.
Then the one ingredient you absolutely love to cook with.
That would depend on what I'm cooking. So, for instance, when I make biryanis, the one ingredient that I love is, of course, mutton. But when I'm making bread, the one ingredient that I love would mean good flour. So, I think that would depend on what I'm cooking.
Okay, sir. The next question: what do you love to do in your free time?
I love to bake bread.
Next question: who do you admire the most?
Who do I admire the most? I admire people like my mom, like my wife, who just bring together things um, so without thinking too much about it. They'll just look, they'll open the fridge, they'll look inside and they'll say, okay, I've got this, okay, just going to make that. For me, it's impossible to do something like that. I need to have this, I need to have this, tuck, 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 tuck. Everything needs to be there before I get to. These people are able to do some things a lot more intuitively. So I think anyone who's an intuitive cook is a person who inspires me.
That's lovely, sir. If you could be one type of bread, which bread would you choose and why?
um, if I could be one type of bread, I'd certainly want to be um, I'd certainly want to be a slow fermented whole grain bread. Why? Uh, because the whole process of slow fermentation is good for anyone who's eating it, and because that flavor is just untouchable. You can't get that flavor um, from any of the other breads that you make. So it's a cut apart. It you know that this is something special. I guess that would be it.
One flavor combination that sounds very odd but tastes really nice.
One flavor combination that sounds very odd. So in Bengal, you have a spice blend called the Panch Foran, um, which is essentially, if you Google, you'll find it, Panch Foran. Um, so when I first came across this in some recipe, I was intrigued and I loved the bite that I got when I had that. So one of the things that I did is I took um, the five components of that, and I sauteed them in a little oil and I added them into bread, and it was just fabulous. It just blew my mind. And everyone who's eaten that has just said, wow, this is just something which is very beautiful. So, Panch Foran in bread is something which strikes me as being great. There are lots of things that way. So, for instance, rosemary um, and sun-dried tomatoes is also fabulous. Um, Sometimes just using Goan chorizo, you make the chorizo, and towards the end, you just incorporate it with a little bit of the um, chorizo fat inside, and then when you turn it and when you bake it, it's fabulous because you see pockets of chorizo when you slice it. It's beautiful. So I don't think I have any favorites, but I think yeah, the ones that I've added that I've just shared with you are, I think, long enough. Sorry,
And the
Anjali, I
last
tend to
question
get
for the
ramble. Yes,
no
yes.
problem, sir. And the last question for the round: what is your go-to comfort food?
My go-to comfort food. My go-to comfort food would be some nice rice, um, preferably full grain rice. And there's a lot which one is getting now. We ordered some from Coimbatore, which is very, very nice. um, a good curry. It could be dal, or it could be sambar, or it could be anything of that sort. A nice sabji, some toran of sorts, maybe a little bit of meat, maybe a papadam. Yeah, I think I like simple stuff. Yeah. So the reason why bread doesn't count is because I have to eat it alone, because the people at home are tired of eating bread. So that's why. Otherwise, I would, my other, favorite thing would be some bread and maybe some meat curry or maybe some nice masala curry. That's another favorite.
Thank you so much, sir. That's all. I'll hand it over to Sanal to give you the thank you speech.
Sure.
Thank you, Anjali. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you. On behalf of the faculty and students of IHM Chennai,
One of the people of the platforms to get certificate at the end of the seminar. Thank you.
thank you, Anjali. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you. On behalf of the faculty and students of IHM Chennai,
One of the people of the platforms to get certificate at the end of the seminar. Thank you.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you. On behalf of the faculty and students